Next up, we have a presentation about Open3D Engine, which is another project that's hosted at the Linux Foundation, so kind of a sister part to Academy Software Foundation.
Hi there. My name is Royal O'Brien. I'm the General Manager of Digital Media and Games over at the Linux Foundation. And I want to take a moment to talk with you about open source, 3D technologies, the future, and where things are really going today. So if you think about it, let's kind of back up for a second and look at some of the different industries of what's going on. For example, in the motion picture industry, they use a lot of open source. They build a lot of open source. They share quite a bit of technology, and it's driven so much innovation. We've seen these things from like The Mandalorian to other projects that have used these kinds of innovations in 3D and advancement across different engines. But the real construct of what becomes part of open source really begins kind of at the foundation level, at the community level. And if you think about it, an open source project is something that really where a community and companies can come around and build something and share and kind of grow that innovation and build those kind of pieces. So the foundation of it really comes down to these communities. And so there are things like open source foundations that really make it easier to kind of coordinate a lot of these cross-project efforts and create some of the best practices and a lot of the shared resources. A perfect example of one of these, since I was already talking about the motion picture industry, is the ASWF. And if you look, they have so many different companies and so many people from the community that share these different open source elements that it's really grown quite a bit. And we've been able to see some phenomenal results and phenomenal movies that have come out of this with some of the wildest things that we never thought was possible 20, 30 years ago. And it's these type of foundations that kind of enable these practices, across the entire motion picture industry. But if you think about it, really, whether it's motion picture, games, metaverse, or really other things, innovation and technology, it's one of those things, it just simply waits for no one. And it is just an element that, as you look at it, it will find, it will go, it will continually progress to where the need is. And since visual stimulus is a big part of it, obviously in the motion picture industry and a lot of others, you'll find out that the cornerstone of where these are being driven to is towards the world of 3D technologies. And so, of course, 3D technologies are very near and dear to my heart because I also serve as the executive director to the Open3D Foundation, which is a project that's dedicated around open source and 3D technologies. And one of the pieces about that is that foundations working with other foundations really can create a lot of elements that you wouldn't see happening from other disjointed industries or things that weren't in practice or used in other ways. It's not very common where you might see something that's in real estate that would turn around and be used over in a video game. But you'll find out those things can apply. And so in this case, if you look at where the Open3D Foundation is, they're actually really well aligned with the ASWF. And it's really about providing the tools so that artists and content creators can actually build the things that they want to build using the tools that they want to use to get this done. And it's important because by doing that, that allows developers to kind of create new things that can bring these together and allow technical artists to really, really shine when they start bringing out their creativity. And so if we think about that for a moment of how that really comes together, it's part of the goal is to really cultivate that kind of environment, cultivate that kind of community. So if you look at the mission of what we're trying to do here, we're trying to basically provide that home for the artists, content creators, developers, technology leaders, so they can kind of congregate and collaborate and share the best practices and shape the future of Open3D development. And so our goal is to really make it possible for these artists and developers to create that content wherever they want, with whatever tools they want to use, simply to remove the barriers and really allow them to pick their choice of tools, develop their kind of tools, to create that interoperability and portability, whether they happen to be assets or visuals, media scripting. I mean, if you think about it, in common DCC chains, we see a lot of Python that's being used. And that language is so flexible, but when you want to do something in automation that goes from, say, Blender or from Maya, and you want to build that into your pipeline, that's really, really important to have that and then be able to share that out to the community for them to be able to do better things on top of it. That's one of the key elements of why having the Open3D engine, the Open3D Foundation working with the ASWF in alignment kind of helps that, because if somebody finds that there are tools that exist inside of that, they can use, say, Python, and drive the entire chain from start to finish and create something that is specific in need of what they want to do. So I keep talking about the Open 3D Foundation and the Open 3D Engine. I'd be curious what that is. And the thing that it is, it's focused around building the first high-fidelity, fully featured, real-time, open-source 3D engine that's interoperable with commercial engines. And that's a really important part here, is that this isn't where it's an open-source project that's just focused on open source. This is an open-source project that's focused on working with commercial engines, commercial projects, commercial tools. Their innovations have been what's driven these industries for so long that trying to rebuild or reinvent the wheel doesn't make a lot of sense. So by embracing them, by bringing them together, and then allowing different technical and developers to build these pieces that tie the rest of the glue, you come out with some really, really interesting pieces that save a lot of time and money. But the key to that really comes down to modularity. You see, the problem is that if I have to spend a lot of time unwinding things to be able to build that tool chain or to build that kind of tool, it just may not be worth it for me to go down that road. So part of what was designed in the Open 3D engine is to have everything complete from end to end for every single aspect of what you would need under an Apache 2 MIT license that is completely permissive, but make sure that it's modular so that you don't have all these dependencies that force you to use things or unwind things that have no relation to what you're trying to do. And by having that kind of modularity, let's just say from a rendering perspective, if you wanted to turn around and turn off the renderer, you could. Or if you want to use the renderer that's already built in, it's brand new. It has OpenColor IO support to make sure you have color accurate imaging, move to any kind of HDR standard that you want to. But the whole thing is, even if that doesn't work for you, let's just say you want to be able to use a newer render, or say Intel's Osprey ray tracing render. You could actually turn the renderer off and turn the Osprey renderer on, and actually still have the complete tool chain and keep the accuracy and have that kind of output that's done from a true ray tracer, not one that's driven per se by GPU. But even to go further from that, I mean, think about it. You have DreamWorks that have their Moonray render that'll be coming out. That's really cloud technologies. Imagine having a 3D engine doing everything in everything in production of what you're doing on your local GPU, and then you simply turn that renderer on. Everything is just as accurate, and you continue moving forward. And the other part of having those modules is to make sure that if there are pieces that you don't need, you simply just don't include them. You turn them off. I mean, if you don't need a whole animation system or you don't need a player input system, disable them so that you have a purpose-driven project that actually meets your needs and is very tightly coupled and performant. And so that is a big element. People think that when you get into a 3D engine, you have to consume the entire thing, but you don't. The idea is, you think, well, why would you want somebody just to pick and choose which libraries? Well, here's the thing. If you use some of these libraries, you probably don't want to spend all your time maintaining them. And so you take the libraries that you want, you make the custom applications that you want, and then you also contribute back just into that library if it makes sense. And you also take the elements that come from the open source community and the Open 3D community, and you take those fixes. So it's one less thing you maintain that you can contribute. When you contribute back, the community wins. When you get to take the upstream fixes and updates, you win. So it works really well, and it gets to be custom to what you want. So remember, it's not an all or nothing. It's really a la carte, what it is that you would like to use to be able to get this done. And this is important for content creators, because then they can move from prototypes that are done on Open 3D Engine to other engines. Recently, we announced that we have Epic Games that has joined, and the Unreal Engine is a phenomenal piece of technology, without a doubt. And so part of what we're working on is to basically create the tools that allow you to move from the open source engine, Open 3D Engine, to Unreal and back, so that you could build prototypes in Open 3D and then move them into Unreal and really use some of their innovations. Or you could have some things in Unreal, and if you have a pipeline that's built in open source on Open 3D, you can use that to be able to traverse it back and forth. So that means assets and shaders, looking at even things like using blueprints and script canvas. Having portability between them is actually a really healthy thing for the market, and it ensures that it kind of allows things to keep moving forward while allowing the commercial companies like Epic to do the amazing innovations that they do. So just something to think about when you look at open source and you look at commercial. This is not an all or nothing scenario. You really should be picking the things and using the things that actually serve you best. That's the whole point. And then contribute back into it. So if you have small things, it makes a big difference. And so you want to allow that piece there where people can go from open source to commercial. Allow your content creators to create things where they want to create them, to build these amazing experiences and not be limited by, when a new feature is coming out or when something can be done. Let them get their hands dirty and really do these things. And so if you kind of think of that, by championing that deep integration of what we have for open source with, say, commercial solutions, we're really accelerating that growth, that sustainable, balanced ecosystem. And that's the whole point of what we've done and where we've focused our foundation. It's that flywheel of success and innovation that allows companies and communities to work together to have resources and to have contributions build something greater together instead of in conflict. And so, as we celebrate our first birthday here at the Open3D Foundation, we're really, really excited to see how the industry has been responding to a lot of the real-time 3D needs that artists and developers around the globe, have been wanting, and really providing some of them with, some of the best in breed tools. And we see them coming from all kinds of angles. The funny thing about open source, you'll find out, is that you just don't know when a feature is going to come out of nowhere. Somebody could have been working on something, and all of a sudden you have this new innovation that you never even knew was coming out of the woodwork that somebody had built. And then it's a matter of having them working with the maintainers to incorporate that. But you can get your hands on that kind of technology and tools whenever you really want to seek it out. But a key element here is to make sure that you have the ability to allow people to communicate together to do that. Now, the parts here that are really important come down to the ability to support this and drive this in a meaningful way. It takes a long time to build a community, without a doubt, and to really get that kind of critical mass. But since our public announcement in July of last year, we've had over 25 member companies that have joined the foundation. And the latest ones that we've had just recently are Microsoft, Lightspeed Studios, a part of Tencent, and Epic Games. But then we also have our other premier members that support us, such as Adobe, Amazon Web Services, Intel, Huawei, Niantic, and a lot of other companies that also help provide a lot of different things for us. So if you think about that, we've spent a lot of time focusing on innovations, performance, and scalability, kind of using a lot of these enhancements. And our aim is to really make it easier to build these 3D simulations, post-production tools for either AAA games or movies or robotics. There's just so many different applications that we really have that you can use. And that's been our number one focus, making sure that we have a roadmap that allows people from the community to kind of push forward the different pieces that we want to do, and also innovate at the same time, such as finishing up our OpenXR spec that allows for AR and VR type of scenarios, but then also from having a newly founded mobile working group, which is focusing on mobile devices and being able to do things like ray tracing on mobile devices, high performance, and even trying to standardize how these are being accessed and used every day with standards like Vulkan and Metal and DirectX. So it really is that part of having companies and community kind of driving those things. And that's what creates that synergy, that kind of excitement that we get in the when we see people kind of contribute in our showcase channel and when they're doing things. And so, but one of the pieces that I really want to talk about also is community, because community is key. And part of that community is their ability to communicate, to support, to be able to actually interact and do a lot of these things. You'll find out that in open source, community is the lifeblood. Without one, you simply don't have a project. It doesn't go anywhere. And so we've spent a lot of time there really working on what are the pieces that we want to make sure that we have. The first one that we thought about was, well, we want people to be able to support each other in real-time chat, to be able to talk about those. That is within context to what they actually want to know about. If they're trying to focus on graphics, I don't need them being in the middle of a bunch of network people, and vice versa. So we've set up things like Discord that allows people to actually communicate with each other, and we have a very vibrant community with a couple thousand people in there, and it's growing every day, and a few hundred that are online at any point in time. And it's funny, you'll watch people that will join and they'll kind of go in the general channel and they'll ask a questions, hey, how do I do this? And somebody will say, well, go over to this special interest group and talk to them over there, and I think you'll find what you're looking for. And they usually do. And it's kind of interesting how that works. But it's not just what you can do in real-time chat, it's what you can also search, it's how you can create issues, it's how you can have meetings. And so we have a calendar that actually runs continuously, which is we keep under Groups.io. Our Discord server, which anybody can join, is discord.gg/O3DE. And when people get involved in this, they can actually come to the meetings, which are all held in public on Discord. And then we keep our minutes. We're well governed, so we actually have our technical advisory committee, our technical steering committee, our governing board, and that's what really drives a lot of it. And the way that our construct is put together, even though we have a lot of companies involved, they do not have the majority vote. The community actually does, but they do have participation on the technical steering committee, which is what really kind of governs all the different special interest groups. We have a very distributed type model where each of the special interest groups look at the features they want to promote for the next version, propose those of what they do, and they drive it. The TSC then works with them to make sure that there are no conflicts and that everything can work together, and then they work with marketing and they focus on building the next release. So that's a lot of how we do that within our own governance, but it allows both community and companies to influence things. It is truly a duocracy. So if you want something to get done, you can drive the entire process with others in the community simply by talking, bringing it up. And so we've seen this happen with a few. I mean, some of our users that we have on there have built container systems that have taken the entire engine and built it into containers like with digital basil leaves. And then we have others that are building games like Epos Studios who've done some amazing work that we've actually seen. Imagination Technologies, they've actually shown, demonstrated ray tracing on low and mid-end mobile device hardware, which is absolutely crazy. And Hadean showing, a lot of the pieces of how you can put some of these elements together to build kind of that metaverse type of experience. So, if you look at how these are being built with the users, they're driven, users and companies, they're actually pushing that envelope forward continuously. It's interesting when you see somebody that they're like, hey, I want to use an audio system, but WWise has one in there that we can use already, or they can use a SoLoud one. But then if they want to use AI, we have an AI system that's also open source that you can use, or they wind up using Kythera AI, which is part of it. So we're seeing some really interesting things that come about that are driving new experiences, every day. And so one of the things that we really want to do is to make sure that as we drive this forward, that we're keeping it as flexible as possible. This is the Open3D engine, not the Open3D game engine. And so we're making sure that we don't shift this into a position where it's kind of like a first shooter that was made to do something else, but more that it is a modular system that's designed to do whatever somebody wants it to do with a minimal amount of work to get it there. That's a key piece here, because when you have to spend a lot of time unwinding code and unwinding experiences, it can cost too much money, too much rebuilding. If you want a new house, you've got to tear the old one down. We want to make sure that there's as little tear down as possible to really push that forward. And so, being that we have these core values of what we like to do, bringing people together, the community, the advancements in technologies, we also make sure that we have one other element, which is we run a show every year, and we call that O3D Con. It runs from October the 17th to the 19th in Austin, Texas. And that conference is not just about the Open3D engine. It is about open source technologies as a whole working with 3D. So in other words, if you look, we have things like GDC and Gamescom and SIGGRAPH, where a lot of things are kind of focused around corporate projects and products. And then you have open source that's tied along into this. This is kind of the opposite of that, where it's focused on open source first and 3D technologies and how it works with different companies. So that's a lot of the focus of what we're doing, and it's about having those points, talking about the hot topics, talking about how people can create new terrain-based systems. What are some of these innovations that they can do? How can you do things where you're rendering multiple layers and adhering to some of the HDR standards? And how do you do a lot of elements? So having those where people can actually dig in and talk and communicate and innovate face to face, it's really, really interesting, but you'll find out that it's not just in one area. You won't just find game development people there. You'll find people from robotics who are very, very careful about how they actually subscribe to a topic and be able to get that robotics element to respond to it, say in a virtual LiDAR type of scenario. And the LiDAR is relying on the 3D of what's being presented, or for AI groups that really have to have that high fidelity to train their video, for the video to train their AI models. So the point is that you may talk to somebody who is not in your industry, but does talk your language. And when they're talking that language, you get a different perspective. And that's what O3DCon is completely about, getting people from other places in other industries to communicate. Now, one of the pieces that's really interesting to talk about, that's always on the top of everybody's mind, is metaverse. But before we even go there, and before we even get into that, with what we know we don't have today, is around what are the pieces that we need to actually get there? And how does that actually have an impact on what we're talking about for the 3D industry? Well, for one, we're going to need kind of standards behind that. Having open source projects like the Open3D engine to be able to help kind of foster that collaboration of graphic formats and interchanges, kind of like the same idea of working along with Epic and Unreal on that engine to allow that interoperability of what we're talking for GLTF, USD, FBX, and having those pieces brought together so that in the future, as these things are being produced, we kind of limit down the number of possibilities and options of how they'll be presented. Because you can't expect the world to just use one engine. It's just not realistic. And we don't expect that either. As a matter of fact, with different engines and projects and forks and commercial applications, it's expected that you're going to see a lot of new technologies in the 3D space. And remember, metaverse doesn't mean that you have to put a VR headset on, okay? It actually means that it could be augmented reality. It could be on your screen as a 3D representation. It could be, of course, with a VR headset. There's a whole array of different things. I mean, who knows? Maybe we'll have a holodeck, right? So, but at the end of the day, you're looking at a 3D coordinate system that has to be able to show and represent in some form. Having that kind of element in open source means that you can come up with an implementation that can actually help drive that forward, not because the open source project could have it, it's so that people can actually take that code and build it into their implementations and build it into what they're doing. And this is why it's really important to support open source and to really get behind that, because it helps make sure that all of that technology is what is intended to be used by the community for free in a standard that is not biased or driven by any kind of ulterior motives. So just keep that in mind of what we're talking about as we move our way towards metaverse and we move our way towards these kind of newer experiences. Now, those are the things that we're focused on. And as a matter of fact, when we do the Open3D conference, the O3DCon conference in Austin, Texas, October 17th and 19th, we'll be having some metaverse talk days there too. We'll have a track to talk about a lot of different elements on metaverse that are surrounding 3D, and also the supporting technologies that actually have to go into it. Because if we want to really give a definition to, what is a metaverse, think of it this way. We surf our web pages today on the internet, okay? But when you start surfing, you open your browser and you go to a website and you start surfing. Now, you don't shut your web browser down and close it to go surf another page. You simply click on a link and you stay in immersion. You don't break immersion. Understand that really for a metaverse to arrive is that the ability to go from server to server, experience to experience, engine to engine, okay, in a meaningful way that doesn't break immersion. And that's a key element. And that means that a lot of these standards have to be built. There has to be ways of communicating them across. In other words, what if you have one server that's a right-hand Cartesian and another one that uses a polar coordinate system? And so you have to be able to allow them to understand how they might be able to communicate, at least so that you can see another experience from one and have a limited amount of interactivity of what it does. Or also from the ability of understanding that there may be 1 million people around you, but you're only really going to see perhaps a few hundred. And that's really important because who's in context, what's around you, what do you like, what do you trust? These are really important, but you don't want them to just be driven by companies. You want them to be kind of influenced by the things that you do. But to do any of that, you still have to have the standards so that people can actually write them. People can actually build them and do the kind of implementations. The interesting thing is that a lot of these technologies, people think, well, we have to invent them. They haven't been built yet. Actually, a lot of them have been built. A lot of them exist in open source already. And that's really what we're going to be focused on when we start talking about that. We talk about how 3D engines like Open3D and Unreal, and even Unity and Godot, which is another fantastic project, how these can work together to allow users to seamlessly move throughout them from place to place. And what are the standards that we can use? And how can we ensure that the back-end services are also kind of doing that computational work to allow people to traverse a lot of that? And it's not just from a 3D perspective. You have to look at it from the edge perspective. You have to look at it from an AI perspective. You have to look at it from kind of that AAA authenticate, identify, and ledgering. There's a lot of different elements that go along with this. So keep that in mind, that when you're thinking about what we're trying to do today in 3D and what we're trying to do with Metaverse for tomorrow, we have the ability of really doing something phenomenal. And open source is a primary vehicle to really get that done, and it allows companies to play in that sandbox in a fair and meaningful way with the rest of the community so that everyone can inure the benefit. At the end of the day, what you want is you want to have kind of the standards and the technologies to be able to be used by anyone. But you want to allow companies to distinguish themselves by the innovations of what they do, so that anybody can basically create something awesome and build a company off of that. And if a company already exists that has these great innovations, guess what? They should continue to innovate and prosper. Open source isn't just a thing that where you only share and you give everything away for free. You actually work with companies and you actually share with the community. And when you bring those two together, it actually progresses things forward. It's about keeping a level playing field by sharing and collaborating. So we invite you to join us at O3DCon, and if anything, take a look. Connect with the Open3D community on Discord, or learn a little more about the engine at o3de.org or github.com/O3DE. And we look forward to having you as part of the community. Thank you very much, and have a great show.